Well, explain a little bit about forests in terms that aren't quite so academic. When you're looking at the patterns of a forest, you don't need to look at the botany. You need to look at the actual, literally the patterns of a forest. So, starting off at the forest floor, we can define it simply, and we need to simplify things. Nature's quite complicated, so if we can look at things in simple, simplified forms, we get kind of a mainframe understanding. So, if you look at a forest, you can classify a forest initially with your climax trees. So you have a climax layer of forest. That's the canopy, that's the large trees. And then underneath those, you get another layer of trees that don't quite make it to the canopy, and they're in the shade of the climax. And these are the understory trees. So understory, in the shade. Underneath those again, there's another layer. So this is the shrubs and bushes that are lower again. They're still woody plants, they're not herbaceous plants, non-woody plants, but they're shrubs and bushes, and they generally don't have a trunk. Then lower down we end up getting into herbaceous plants, little plants that don't have any wood. In some climates there's 2 layers of these, especially the cold climates. The cold temperate climates that have winter rain and summer dry, they can have 2 layers of herbs, the typical European climate. But we'll just put it in as 1 layer. So you have the herbs. Below there again, we can have a ground covering layer. The plants that are prostrate and creep across the ground. They can be woody and non-woody, but they're physically a ground covering function or layer. So you have your ground covers. And in the basic layers, the main layers, there's one more layer here, and that's the climbing layer, the vertical layer, the climbers. These are the main layers of a forest. Let's count them through. We had 1, the climax, 2, the understory, 3, the shrubs, 4, the herbs, 5, the ground covers, 6, the climbers. Those layers are in every forest, doesn't matter what climate it is. But there are other layers. Like I mentioned before, there's 2 layers of herbs, tall and short herbs in the cooler climates, the colder climates, the temperate forests. You can also have clumpers, plants that grow by divisions and clump. So they can be part of a forest. Clumpers. You could classify another layer. You could classify the root yield layer. Plants that may be deciduous and go down to the ground, die down, and put all their store all their energy in roots and come again in the growing season, or just generally grow from roots. So you could say there is a root yield layer. So we've got 2 more layers now. We've got to 8 layers. In the tropics, and starting at the subtropics to the tropics, you can also have palms. So you can have a palm layer in the forest. Palms. And in the wet tropics, you can typically have 2 layers of palms. When you get near the equator, you also get what are called emergent palms, that can long skinny palms that stick right at the top of the forest. the emergent palm layer. Now that's specifically to the wet tropics, the emergent palms. You don't need to know anything about botany. You don't really need to know anything about ecology. You just need to be able to observe layers with your pattern eye. And everybody has a pattern eye. You just need to be told to use it and discover it. It's a inherent function that we have to be able to recognize form and pattern and shapes, particularly in nature, because we love those patterns. So it's one thing to understand the layers of a forest, and it's a wonderful thing to go into a forest and see all this amazing interactions of form and feel like you're in a complete ecosystem, almost like an organism to itself, cycling nutrients and many animal interactions, which are actually just mobile parts of the forest. Indigenous people can't separate the animals from the forest. They just see the animals as a high expression of the forest. And if top predators are alive, then we have, in a forest, we have a full expression of forest. So if you're in the Amazon, a hunting pair of jaguar need 35,000 hectares of pristine Amazon. So they're the ultimate expression of the forest. Well, that's all real nice, but how do you create a forest? How do you get from bare ground or damaged ground or farmed ground or grazed ground, whatever condition you're starting with, how do you get it up? How do you build into a forest? It just doesn't jump out of the ground into those sophisticated layers. So we've got to look at imitating how nature repairs itself. How does the succession function in nature? Now that's not such an exciting study for most people. If you're a permaculturist, if you study permaculture as a design system, it's much more interesting than the forest itself, because you're actually looking at function leading to form. So it's the mechanics, it's the engineering, it's the design study of the ecology. It's the lesson the ecology gives you and directs you to act. So what we have to do is we have to look at nature in the way it repairs. Now, if we start off with the ground here, say, right, what would we do first? We need a whole lot of support species. And now I'm going to relate them, these species, in not just size, but in time. So a time element's come in. It's not just the form, it's not just the technique, but it's the strategy as an element of time. We can put in our ground cover just to repair the ground, just to put an initial cover. This is often a nitrogen fixing plant. In fact, a lot of the recovery plants are nitrogen fixing plants. They have an association in their root system with microorganisms, bacteria, that take starch from the plant and give back nitrogen and add nitrogen to the soil. And that nitrogen's free, it comes from the air. So there's nitrogen fixation in the soil. And this plant, this ground cover, can be mass planted, and it's only going to live for one season. It's got 6 months to get all its growing done. So it has to do everything fast. The next element would be a small bush, also fixing nitrogen in the soil. Selected out of those particular plants which are leguminous, nitrogen fixing, the peas and the beans family. And this one would live for a little bit longer. So this would be what we call a short term legume bush. and it may live for 4 to 5 years. Our next, and that can be planted, or these two can be planted by seed. Our next one can be planted by seed or as a small tree, a small potted tree from a nursery, and it will also be fixing nitrogen. And we'll call this a medium term, and it's a little bit bigger in size, and it's a medium term legume tree. But this one's going to live for 10 to 15 years. It lives longer, it grows a little bit slower, it can grow from seed. You can put some in by seed, and you can put some in pots already started. You can go both ways. It's a little bit larger in size and a little bit longer in years. The one just before it was a little bit smaller in size and a little bit shorter in years. And the ground cover, which we only seed, there's many more of those, and they're much smaller in size and much shorter in years. Now the next one is larger in size again, and this is the long-term legume tree. And this one lives full term. It goes on as a canopy tree of the forest, and it has long-term cycles of nitrogen in the ground. Now, there's in just a few square meters, there's hundreds of thousands of these. There's tens of thousands of these. There's thousands of these. And there's only 100 of these. When the forest is mature and it's gone through these cycles in time and space, in 6 months they're all gone. There might be a few around the edge that regenerate, but not many. In the end, there's very few of those. There's maybe 10 here and there around the edge. With the medium-term legume trees, there's maybe 100, maybe only 50, and most of them have been used for mulch. And of the long-term legume trees, there's probably only 10 left. Just 10, or maybe even just 5. And that's over 1,000 square meters, if you're relating it to size. So they have time stacked out of the equation. We have overstacked the ground. Now what is important is that while all this has been going on, so has the fruit trees. So inside this, we've had understory fruit trees, medium-sized fruit trees, and some overstory fruit trees. How can they possibly fit in the same space? Well, this side of the equation over here, this side, has been 90% of the mass has been support species. So our support species, these actual fertilizing trees, the support species, are 90% of the mass in the early years. And the fruit trees, or the productive trees, because they might not all be fruit, there might be other types of productions in this forest. The productive trees are 10% of the mass. In the early years. At the end, it reverses. At climax, the support species are only 10%. And at climax, the fruit trees are 90%, or the productive trees, let's call them, are 90%. We've not only filled the space, we've stacked it in layers. We've kept the layers full with the fast-growing support species. We've switched the spatial relationship. So these trees have nurtured the productive trees into existence. That's exactly what happens in a natural forest. There is an exchange between the pioneering weedy type species, which are actually fast carbon pathways, building soils, structuring soils, fixing nitrogen, dropping organic matter to the soil, building up soil life, and they time stack out of position as the climax forest comes in, which is more sophisticated, not such fast carbon pathways, but end up as more sophisticated in their end result. Now, but this is our own design. We've designed this around the functions of nature. So at certain times, and it's very relevant, we choose the right time, more timing, not just technique, strategy again coming in. Another time element at the right time, which is when the rainfall is over the evaporation, not when the rainfall is less than the evaporation. If the evaporation is very high at that time of year, you leave the shade. Shade is better than mulch. But when the rainfall is higher than the evaporation, we can speed up these cycles. So we can come in and we say this tree can be cut for mulch, and we've chosen species where that tree will regrow again. So there is selected species that will pollard, they will regrow. Now the mulch that came off there goes to a fruit tree. Every one of these species here can be cut, or most of them. Our preference of support species is that they can be cyclers of organic matter, and we can speed that cycle up. So we can cut them, and a lot of them we can cut at head high, so they become our shade umbrellas. They're not only shading the forest floor and they're shading the fruit trees, but they're actually shading us too. And they will regrow again. Now if we time it right, when the evaporation is high and the rainfall is diminished, they've grown back and they've got their cover over the top, which will nurse the ground and nurse the young fruit trees. So all of these are sacrificial and they will regrow. If they don't regrow, that's fine. That's fine, not a problem. Look how many we've got. We've got so many more than we need. We have overstacked the area so that there is hardly any room for weeds. The weed interaction now is almost insignificant. Something else is going on. When you cut the top and take that mulch over to your fruit trees, which are very close by because they're all interacting together, you've planted them all as one system, the root zone self-prunes as well. Because a tree essentially is a pump, and the water in the tree is hanging from the leaves. It's transpiring off the leaves, and it's a complete column of water all the way down to the base of the roots. And those nodules of nitrogen fixing bacteria are living on those roots. And when you cut off the starch supply, that nitrogen drops off. And you now, not only have you mulched the trees with nitrogen rich mulch, you've actually fixed nitrogen into the soil. All this happens in nature around the life cycles of these elements, the short term, the medium term, the long term. They're all cycles that are going on anyway. But you can orchestrate those cycles so you can speed it up. You can actually improve forest ecology. You can make systems more productive, more fertile, and richer than nature itself. And especially now, where we have the world's species of productive trees and plants, more and more we have collections of mass diversity from completely around the globe that we can put into these mixes. It doesn't matter which climate it is. It doesn't matter whether it's desert, doesn't matter if it's tropics, doesn't matter whether it's temperate or subtropics or island landscapes near the ocean. This basic system, this basic mimic of the pioneer weed functions, reparative mechanisms of ecology, works to create sustainable, long-term, permanent, productive forest ecologies that we can design. We can do it. We just have to put the right elements to work for us. And it will go on indefinitely. And that's what we are demonstrating while we go around teaching people how you can do these cycles of nutrient with the support species of trees, leading towards long-term diverse forests of production.